Welcome to episode 4 in this series talking about change. This episode examines the roots of violence. In this series, more generally, we are exploring an approach to reflecting on and analyzing change, an approach that can generalize to different domains in our own lives, in our families and communities, in the broader society, even on Earth and in the universe as a whole, from the Big Bang on. But in this episode, we will try to tackle the issue of violence and its causes. The change that we desire, of course, is that we move from violent responses to responses that promote peace and understanding. A good starting point is to acknowledge the reality of violence and aggression in human beings. Looking over our history, we might understandably conclude that we seem wired as a species to be violent. Well, let's begin with a definition of violence. Violent actions are actions intended to harm others, especially when that harm is enduring and undermines the victim's well being, causing the victim suffering. And someone responds in a violent way when they feel threatened, whether that threat is perceived or real. Now, the nature of the threat can vary widely. People behaving in a violent way may, for example, feel a threat to respect that they are due, or a threat to the moral order of society, or to their privilege or property, to their power and control, to their authority, to their safety and security, to goals that they value, and so forth. And there are a range of responses that they may make to feeling this threat. But being violent is certainly one impulse that we have as human beings, much like a dog that feels cornered lashing out. Both the sources of the perceived or real threat and the ways in which we respond to the felt threat vary widely, and under the appropriate circumstances will take the form of violence. Well, what are those circumstances? I feel a sense of threat when I believe that I detect a difference between my values, beliefs, interests, even group affiliation, versus the person who is the target of my aggression. As a species, we are very prone to responding negatively to difference as we try to determine whether another person is with us, a member of our own group, or somehow against us, and usually belonging to another group or tribe. You can become the victim of my violent impulse because I see you somehow as the other. I may even view you as somehow subhuman when the difference that I detect is a difference I feel really matters, a difference that I believe should elicit a violent response. Whether or not the difference matters and might provoke violence depends, in great part, on the meaning my culture ascribes to that difference and the responses deemed socially acceptable to that difference. In the broader culture of which I am part, the difference that is especially scorned might be based on skin color, or ethnic background, or language, or politics, or religion, or status in society. In my culture, it might be deemed appropriate to lynch a black man accused of making a perceived sexual advance to a white woman. In another culture, there may be strong norms against treating a slave cruelly, with even serious sanctions against beating a slave. Spelling out the circumstances under which violence occurs suggests ways to either incite greater violence on the one hand, or reduce the likelihood of violent responses on the other hand. To foment violence, one may increase the sense of difference between one person or group and another person or group. You may, for example, have a village where Muslims and Christians have coexisted peacefully for a very long time. A politician, though, may come along and may see a way to gain power and influence by persuading people in the village that there is some significant difference between those who are Christian and those who are Muslim. A difference that matters, a difference that should be viewed as a threat to the identity of one group versus the other group. Now a difference has been cast as a threat, and a violent response may be suggested, encouraged, maybe even mandated. On the other hand, violence may be diminished if this sense of otherness is decreased. The group perceived as other may be humanized and commonalities emphasized. The white police officer who spends time in a community of color that he's charged to serve and protect, perhaps by being a big brother to kids in the neighborhood, playing basketball with teenagers in an after-school program, or implementing traffic safety classes with elementary school children, that police officer who works closely like this with youth from the community is far less likely to behave in a hostile way toward them when he patrols that community. His constructive and pro-social activities with the community have diminished his sense that the young people of color who he encounters are the other. And it will make it more likely that he responds to them with temperance, tolerance, and understanding, even in the face of any potentially problematic behavior in which the youth might engage. In addition to changing perceptions of seeming otherness, either by heightening those perceptions of otherness or diminishing them, another set of actions that can be taken in response to threat is to modify responses to that felt threat. For example, if you feel a threat to your status from another person, it may be seen as appropriate to oppress that person, to take away the person's rights, property, and most fundamentally, the person's dignity. You may think this aggression will better ensure or restore your status. A woman who is seen as a member of the enemy group may be raped. And this rape may be deemed routine and regular by the larger society or by the warring group and its leadership. Settings of conflict and war especially open the door to pillaging, torture, violence of all sorts, particularly against vulnerable groups such as non-combatant citizens, women, and children. The violence done to people because they are construed as other, as different in important respects, and thus as a threat to you and the social order, escalates in these settings. The violence becomes a patterned response to these perceived and sometimes real threats. These responses are part of the repertoire of responses available to you in your culture. and validated by the norms in your community and broader society. Now, this suggests what may be done to diminish violent responses. Norms against violent responses may be established in a society, especially by leaders of a community. Soldiers, for example, may be taught to follow the rules of the Geneva Convention, dictating that they may not engage in torture and that they treat prisoners of war humanely. Rules of engaging the enemy may be reinforced by senior officers, thereby quelling widespread violence in settings of war. On a smaller scale, a boy who feels as though another boy is threatening his need to feel respected may learn how to respond differently to the threat than by violence. A school program intended to interrupt violence may teach him to restrain his impulse to behave violently, so that he now talks through his feelings of being disrespected by the other boy, or he learns to walk away instead of escalating the tension and bad feeling in that encounter. You can also engineer the environment to make violent responses less likely. For example, you can guarantee that no weapons are allowed in spaces where people who sense difference and threat come together to resolve their hostilities. Not having those weapons at hand sets up a potential barrier to responding in a violent way. Even though violence has been a long-standing feature of our societies, and we appear to be hardwired as a species to respond aggressively to a sense of threat, we don't have to accept high levels of violence in our communities. These violent tendencies and impulses may be channeled in different forms, some better for the health of society than others. So, for example, the sense of threat may take, and the response to it may take the form of seemingly never-ending armed conflict between two groups. Or, on the other hand, it may take the form of simply benign rivalry between two sports teams. Or it may take the form of a man routinely and regularly abusing his wife and children. Or, on the other hand, in the form of a couple's interaction, which, while they might argue frequently, learn how to surface and communicate their differences and come to constructive agreements on how to live with those differences or even resolve them. What drives the change from violent forms of dealing with felt threat to more peaceful and constructive forms of responding to felt threat is the establishing of connections. If I can work to build bridges to other people and groups, that sense of connectedness will help me see the other as holding a common humanity with me. If I live in a community that values and fosters connections among diverse people and groups, and the community generally expects people to resolve differences constructively, then forms of action will be available in the culture and society that allow for authentic engagement in the community, peaceful resolution of tensions and conflicts, and constructive back and forth dialogue in an open society marked by mutual respect and a healthy, vibrant diversity. If you found this episode stimulated fruitful thought for you about the roots of violence and changes needed to reduce violence, and you'd like to support me in developing more content related to discussing change more generally in all its forms, head over to my page on patreon.com at patreon.com/talkingaboutchange, all lowercase and strung together, patreon.com/talkingaboutchange, and become a patron. Thank you, and all the best.